That is such a cool song. And a good one for us to think about today as we think about both what we experience, as DeAndre was saying in her prayer, just the stuff of every day that overwhelms us sometimes, and that we just can't believe, just more crises, more pain. But then also, what is it that we hold on to that sort of helps us realize that we are still embraced in the reality of love and the presence of love and the possibilities of grace. And so there is this catch and release that sort of happens, that sort of is a part of what it means to be in faith. And today we're going to talk about, we're in this series, right? We're in this series of This Is Us, kind of a church-wide series that everybody's doing right now. And you can have the 3 for day where you go and you come at 8:30 in the morning on Sunday and you can see one sermon preached about it. Then you can come at 9:30 and see another sermon preached about it. You can come at 11:11 and see something completely destroy the whole idea. So, which is what I love to do. So we're taking these themes and we're kind of doing our thing with them and speaking to our context and our community and trying to understand what this means, who we are. This is us, which is an interesting thing, particularly in light of what our denomination is trying to figure out right now. I mean, exactly who is us, given that whole thing. So I'm going to presume you all know what I'm talking about, that some of you are not sure, have all caught up with the General Conference vote that happened in February. If not, again, though, please go to the website and find out lots of information where we are with all of that. I'm going to start with a simple little story. Some of you have heard it before, but it just seemed like so apropos, I'm going to repeat it again. The great founder of the Hasidic faith, of the traditional mystical tradition of the Jewish faith, his name was Baal Shem Tov, the Rabbi Baal Shem Tov. When he was dying, this was in the 17th century, when he was dying, there was a story told about him that as he lay on his deathbed, his disciples gathered around him for his final insights and his final teachings. And so they gathered closest to him, as is wont of ecclesiastical bodies. They gathered the wisest that they determined among them to be the closest, so that the information would be disseminated correctly. Whatever that last bit of advice was, it would be passed along to the wisest and most traditional and faithful, and then passed along to all of those down the line in succession until you got at the very end of the line, which it went around the bed and it went out the hall and then down through the hallway and down the steps and it went down the block, down the street. And at the very end was just some of the folks that are sort of like gathered on going like, what's going on here? And they just kind of stepped in line. So they finally got everyone gathered, and the disciple leaned into his master, and he says, Rebbe, tell us then, what is it? What is the meaning of all of this? What is the meaning of our lives? And the Rebbe opened his eyes, and just gasping for his last few breaths, and he looks up at the disciple, and he says, life is like a river. And then he closed his eyes and was barely breathing. The disciples pondered, the first disciple pondered this for a moment, and then he smiled, and his illuminated, his face, his glowed. He turned to his disciple next to him, and he passed the word along. Life is like a river. And as it went around the bed and down the hall, it began to get processed. Of course, life is like a river. Life is like a river, and it kept going down the line. Life is like a river. There is flow. It must flow. Life must flow, but it is contained within boundaries, right? And sometimes there are rocks. We must roll over the rocks, around the rocks, but we are contained within these boundaries. Life flows within boundaries. And as it kind of got further on down the line, people were saying, yeah, but then there's tributaries and the water breaks off. And what about droughts? And sometimes the river runs dry. And then how do you cross the river if there's a river between you and the other side? And all these questions kept rising until finally the guy at the very end was like, what does he mean life is like a river? Tell the Rebbe we need some clarification. And so the question went back up the line. It came up the street. It came down to the house. It came up the steps. It came into the hallway. What does the Rebbe mean? What do you mean life is like a river? Until it finally came around to the closest, most responsible disciple who looked at the person and said, hey, fine, and then leaned over to the Rebbe. And to everyone's amazement, he was still alive at this point, and he leaned over and he said, Rebbe, I am sorry, we don't understand. What do you mean life is like a river? And the Baal Shem Tov, as if a little frustrated, opened his eyes and said, oh, so who knows, maybe it isn't. And he died. So So we have these ideas, we have these beliefs, we have this notion of what does it mean to grow in our faith. And I want to play along with these ideas of faith and belief. I'm going to kind of go back and forth a little bit with the idea of faith and belief. You know, you can take the word scared and it can become sacred, which can then become scared, and all you have to do is flip 2 letters. Right? Sacred, scared, sacred, scared. But seeing the world from the perspective of scared versus the perspective of sacred, from the perspective of fear versus the perspective of love, is more a matter of consciousness than of belief. And the challenging thing about consciousness is that you can't simply switch 2 letters to change your consciousness. It's nothing nearly as easy as that, right? Richard Rohr makes a distinction between belief and faith as one of ego identity and letting go in order to become part of something larger. And so he distinguishes that we go through these phases or these halves. He's got a book called Falling Upward, and in it he talks about how we have the first half of our lives, of our spiritual lives, where many people sort of get stuck, in fact. But that is centered around kind of our identity, how we identify ourselves, what we identify with. And it makes sense because in our early lives, we're trying to find our way in the world. We're trying to understand who we are in relationship to others. And as we move into the world, we begin to align ourselves with certain groups or certain tribal ways of thinking. And we want to belong because belonging provides a sense of safety, provides a sense of those boundaries along the river, right? And so we like that. We need that. And it makes perfect sense. And he says over time, we adopt beliefs in the same way because they sort of provide some sense of security. Not so much because they make sense. And sometimes we'll say that some beliefs don't make any sense, but we're told, hang on to them, believe them anyway, because it's a matter of faith. But I think that's to confuse what faith is really about and what beliefs are really about. Much of our lives are oriented around these narratives that define us, these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, like what it means to be a good parent or a good man or a good woman or a good wife or successful at work or life. These stories are often deeply rooted in our cultural narratives, right? I mean, we hear them growing up, we see them in the media, but they're also rooted in our family narratives, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. Sometimes we feel that our family narratives are completely at odds with who we feel we are ourselves. And so we can't shake these ones as well as the ones that sometimes we would like to tell. We continue to tell them even though they're somewhat self-destructive or self-sabotaging or self-inhibiting. Biblical stories and beliefs come into our lives in much the same way. And so to be a good Christian, because we want to belong with a good community, we find or adopt certain stories and the beliefs behind those stories. For some people, it's simply too much of a rational leap to believe the stories and therefore the beliefs. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under the whole Apostles' Creed. I've been told by more than a few of you in here that simply meant you just couldn't sit you couldn't sit in a service where that was recited every Sunday morning because it just seemed too contrary to your reasoning. And there are others who have simply left the church because they don't see the beliefs that the church espouses really being practiced, and some of them so illogical that they don't make any sense that they simply don't see any reason to be at the church at all or to darken the door of the church. A good 2/3 of my son's friends, who didn't necessarily grow up in the church, probably hadn't been in a church since they were small children, have absolutely no interest in church life or being a part of a church. Not simply because of its supposed contradictions in terms of the news that they read and the strange extremities that you find happening because of religion, but even more so because the stories that are told seem so illogical to them. And so they wouldn't even bother to darken the door. While for others, it's simply a matter of bifurcating beliefs so that we can hold on to some of these beliefs as sort of anchors in our identity, right? They sort of identify us with a group, and so we can hang on to them. A story may become important to us because of what it represents the community we grew up in, and we can hold inconsistent beliefs or reasoning in one place and keep it separate from other places in our thinking. My father, who was a brilliant man, used to always challenge me on some of the early beliefs I had as a fundamentalist. I don't necessarily blame him for challenging me, though, but at the time, in those days, I found it very confronting and very difficult. And so he'd say, how can you even believe in such a thing, given science, given Galileo, given Copernicus, given where we've come in our enlightenment? How can you even hold on to such ridiculous notions? And in his mind, I could see why this would be a problem, because for him, science had taught us so much. So now we're having to reinterpret stories in order to accommodate science. Why not think of them in some other way altogether? And I couldn't do that. I couldn't grasp that. But my father couldn't grasp any other way of seeing it as simply illogical, and so he professed to be an atheist, which I always laughed at. He grew up Irish Catholic. My father was born in Ireland, and he grew up Irish Catholic. And from young adulthood, after attending Yale, he had decided he would never have anything to do with the church again. But if you ever went to his house, it was always lined with all sorts of Catholic iconography, right? There was a sacristy at this door, and another sacristy at this door. There were crosses everywhere. And I would often laugh and I'd say, I think maybe you're not telling the whole truth. But then that's the problem, right? I mean, faith has more to do with the whole truth than belief does, right? I mean, sometimes the truth is, sometimes what we think of as fact is so far from actually the truth. And sometimes the truth that we tell about these facts is more lying than truth. I'll get back to that in a second. Problems arise when beliefs become driven so much by fear that they become justifications for narratives that are oppressive. That's my thinking. I think at some point beliefs can become dangerous because they become justifications for oppressive narratives. We see this in our own church, right, as we're struggling with sexual identity and sexual discrimination, LGBTQ discrimination in our church over marriage and ordination. But we also see it in the sense that the narratives become so oppressive that right and left can't talk to each other, or either or can't talk to each other, or this and that can't find any common ground to talk. We see it in our global church, but we even see it more horrifically in these senseless acts of violence that happen in our world, like the bombings in New Zealand, that are related to this kind of narrow-minded, limited belief system that is based more in fear than in rationality, more in narratives that someone grew up with than in a higher consciousness. There is a significant difference, a life-altering difference between belief and faith. So if we want to talk about growing in faith, I think we have to talk about beliefs in a healthy way. And the first thing I think we have to do is we have to see that beliefs have to do with objects. Beliefs have to do with object relationship. Beliefs are static. We say we believe in something and we hold to it. We become almost patriotic about beliefs in such a way that they become static. They're immovable. They're immobile. They're like concrete. So we don't give them much thought other than clinging to them. They literally exist, or they're held in our minds in a very significant part of the brain that deals with rationality and memorization. That's why so many of us memorized verses when we were in more conservative churches. They also get tied to emotions like fear and anxiety, especially if we connect the beliefs with some of our most basic fears, like mortality and death and safety and health. They become like I call them the wide rides, the 18-wheelers of our neurological system. They're like freight trains. You start loading down the cars with the beliefs, and they just start barreling through everything else. There's no room for reflecting, because the ride is too wide. These big freighters are so hard to move, right, when they're in the ocean. Trains with 100 cars are so hard to slow down. So the longer we've held to these ideas, the more they feel like they're a part of our lives and how important they are. And they are. Not to say that we need to disabuse one another of things that we hold important, but it's also dangerous, because they do become like these immovable freight trains that sort of just plow through reason. what that tells us, if we ever try to rationally discuss ideas with others who hold very tightly to certain beliefs, and I'm talking on either side of it. I hope you understand I'm talking about that. I shared this last week. The neurological chemistry behind our beliefs, whether they are positive and comforting or whether they are frightening, we hold to them for the same chemistry reason, because we get anxious when they get challenged. So no matter where we stand, when we get anxious, the same chemistry starts to happen, and it reinforces our stance on that position because it's addictive. It's chemistry. You understand that? So that's why we can't ever talk with one another about different issues, regardless of who's right or wrong, because we are too addicted to our positions. Whether it's right or wrong. You understand what I'm saying? That's the problem with beliefs. It has to do more with our chemistry than it has to do with faith. Well, that's a strange thing, I think, for us to hear sometimes, but I want to suggest what Richard Rohr says is that you don't ever move into that wider sense of consciousness, that higher sense of consciousness, that more reflective place of consciousness, what he calls second phase or second half spirituality. He says typically that doesn't happen until something derails the train, until something takes it off its track, or something stops the freighter in the midst of the ocean, or something, the engine dies, and some tragedy or some catastrophe or crisis in our life. Typically, we don't come into this place of beginning to reflect on things until something has challenged us. Now, that's not true for all of us. Some of us grew up in families that sort of challenged us from the very beginning. I mean, my whole desire to find how things are connected grew out of a family that was completely disconnected, right? I mean, I had a completely dysfunctional family. Abuse, alcoholism, divorce early in there. A lot of people in my family living behind personas that they thought would be what helped them move into the next thing that they needed to move, that would hold them secure through their lives, to be the perfect mother, to be the perfect wife, to find the perfect spouse that would save the family. I mean, all of these things were part of these narratives that were not healthy, but we didn't know any better. But what I did begin to notice is that things weren't connected. Things were disconnected. I just had this natural sense that things were broken. In fact, I knew I was broken too. So for me, it became a process of trying to find connections. It became a process of asking questions about the questions. And sometimes that can be very frightening. Sometimes that can be scary to find yourself in those places when you start asking questions of the things that you supposed were what held life together. One of my favorite quotes is in this bulletin. I can't separate my pages here. There we go. Christian Wyman has a great book, and I encourage you to read it. Christian Wyman grew up as a Southern Baptist and a Pentecostal background, charismatic, and he experienced cancer. He's a journalist, and he experienced cancer. Pretty well-known journalist. I forget if it was Washington Post or one of those. He has this quote in here. He says, "When I was younger, I would have said God calls us to faith in order to believe. But now I am thinking sometimes God calls us to unbelief in order for faith to grow." What a strange idea. Every religious tradition has this understanding, right? Buddhist tradition says if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. I mean, every religious tradition recognizes the danger of holding too fast to an idea, to concretize an idea, make it so static that it becomes deadly, it becomes dangerous, it becomes limiting. Becomes like a freight train just making its way through everything else and knocking the things aside. Years ago, when I asked my seminary professor, some of you saw this in my blog if you read the blog, I asked him what it was about his own faith, because I came into seminary out of Christian InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and out of the Bible Church. So I pretty much came into seminary with my ideas fixed. I knew what was right and wrong. I knew what to believe and what not to believe. I knew what it meant to be a Christian and not to be a Christian. And I knew who was backsliding, who was falling away, who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. I knew all that stuff. You should be really glad I have no more idea now. You can come right up to me. I have no idea if you're going to heaven or hell. I don't know. And more importantly than that, I don't even believe in that. But that doesn't matter. Even if I did, I don't know what would happen to you. But after class once, he said something in class that really troubled me, and I asked him because I kept wanting my theology professor to nail down this belief, to nail it down for me in a way that I understood it from what I'd grown up with for the past 10 years in the Bible church. And so he told me this story. He said, a class of students went to their master and said, help us to find God. And the master said to them, I can't do that. The students said, why not? Isn't that why we are here, to find God? And the master smiled and said, I hope not, because helping you to find God would be like trying to help a fish find the ocean. Then Dr. Rout looked at me and he said, perhaps maybe doing theology is more about teasing ideas enough to get us out of those hiding spaces, those coral spaces in the reef, so that we can just get out and see just how big the reef is itself, and maybe even then how wide the ocean is and how we can swim and have always been able to swim from the start. Sometimes God calls us to unbelief in order for faith to grow. So I want to tell you a short little story to end with. Y'all just stand up there. We're not going anywhere. It's a good song at the end. You don't want to miss it. That's why we always put it at the end. I got to sit through the end of Tom's thing here before. This past week, Linda and I had a really difficult time. We had a very tragic sort of event happen. I mean, I think it's going to be fine. But our dog, we've inherited a dog from our son, 2 dogs actually, from our son, and because he can't have one where he is. And so we've had him for 6-8 months, and they've gotten along very well with our dog. But on Thursday, one of the dogs, which is a pit bull, one of them attacked our other dog and just tore him up really bad. And it was Linda's birthday on Thursday. And so even today, we're still dealing with him. We have to lift him. He's a big old 70-pound American hybrid bulldog, and so we have to still pick him up to try to get him from the chair to the floor so he can walk, because his leg's pretty mangled up and his ear's practically torn off. And so there's just a lot of damage. And it's going to be a slow recovery, and it's kind of pitiful. But it happened Thursday, and Thursday was Linda's birthday. And so Thursday evening, we'd planned on going downtown, we're going to do the riata, had the whole evening planned out. It was going to be a beautiful night, story night, and then go down for dinner. It was just a wonderful evening. And at 4:30 is when the dog got attacked, and so we spent from 4:30 to 8:30 at the hospital, at the vet hospital. Then left him overnight for surgery and such, and picked him up the next day. But meanwhile, we decided, okay, well, I've lost our reservation. And so it was just kind of miserable. And we ended up going to the Press Cafe. And they have an upstairs area, and it's nice up there. And we sat up there, and the waiter was very nice. They were only going to be open for another hour, but it was really beautiful. And we were having the hardest time. They sat us down at the table, and right behind us was a family with an infant. And, I mean, number one, it was late for an infant to be out, but there was a family and a couple of couples and their child, and they were having a good time, but the infant wasn't having a good time. I mean, he was exhausted, or she, I wasn't even sure really, but it was just crying, and Linda and I were looking at each other like, could this night get any worse? And I mean, we were just, right, we had our expectation, life is supposed to go this way, everything was lined up, and then boom, something happens, right? That's just the way of things sometimes. And so we're sitting there, we order a couple of drinks, and we can't move, the tables are all pretty busy, and we wouldn't really be able to get that far away, and so we're just listening to this, and so the waitress says, you know, I'll take some orders, but it's beautiful outside, why don't you go outside and just take a walk along there. So we took our drinks and we're walking along the walkway, the bike trail. And it is beautiful. The stars are out and it's a cool night and it's just very quiet and it's beautiful. And then Linda we're just walking and talking about how things happen. And I said, yeah, I mean, how do we let go of what we came with so that we can experience what we have? Right? I mean, that was the question. How do we let go of what we came with so we experience what we have? And Linda kind of smiled and said, well, I don't know, maybe the baby's gone when we get back. and then she said, but maybe not. She said, what if we imagine, I mean, we do have two infant, we have a small toddler and we have an infant granddaughter as well as our 6-year-old, and she says, you know how much fun we have with them? Well, they're having fun with their daughter or their child, even though the child's sleepy, but that child is really important to them. And she said, maybe if we try to change how we're thinking about this. I said, okay. So we got up there, and sure enough, the baby was still there, and the baby was still kind of whining and making loud noises, and we sat down at our table, and I said, what if we've suddenly arrived on a planet where babies hold special power? And she smiled and she says, like what? And I said, well, like to be next to a baby is like such great fortune. I mean, to be present with an infant like this, and if they are starting to say things, to be present to that is to receive blessings upon blessings. And I mean, it's just such an honor to have that chance to be. And then she looked at me and she said, look, we're getting them now. You know, because the baby was making all these noises, and we both started to laugh. And we just kept pushing this narrative, right? We just kept pushing the humor of this narrative, that if we just change our minds enough about it, things start to change too. And sure enough, eventually the baby quieted down, and even when it got loud, we'd laugh and we'd say, oh, what information are we gathering now at this moment? How wonderful, right? And it turned out to be such a fun, beautiful evening. But the trick came in realizing sometimes we have to simply change the narrative in order to hear something larger. And the same is true with how we approach faith. I think to grow in faith, sometimes we have to be willing to have this unbelief. If not unbelief in doctrine, sometimes unbelief in our own position in order to hear something else. There's no need to be afraid of changing our position or opening up to another, because what we're not looking for is to win. What we're looking for is to see the ocean, right? The bigger picture. That's why I think diversity is so important, because it's not about you or me. It's about the diversity. It's about the ocean. It's about the kingdom. And only when we can sort of change our own narratives do we begin to invite the kingdom to be more present. Amen.